Good morning, folks. Today we're looking at chapter 15 and we're focusing on two things: voice and language and playful versus rigid interpretation of words. In chapter 15, as you'll know from reading, we get introduced to Mrs. Bertha Flowers, who Maya describes as, quote, "the lady who threw me my first lifeline," end quote. The wealthy African-American woman helps Maya by befriending her and inspiring her to speak again. Miss Flowers says to Maya, quote, "Now, no one is going to make you talk. Possibly no one can. But bear in mind, language is man's way of communicating with his fellow man, and it is language alone which separates him from the lower animals. Words mean more than what is set down on paper. It takes the human voice to infuse them with the shades of deeper meaning," end quote. There are two really important ideas here that we need to unpack. The first idea is that language is what separates humans from other animals. Although I disagree with this, other kinds of animals do communicate in a variety of ways. All the same, it has a big impact on Maya and makes her think of language as a specific way for humans to connect with other humans. Miss Flowers' next move hits Maya on an even deeper level. She points out to Maya that, quote, "words mean more," end quote, "than what is written on the page." She states that, quote, "the human voice infuses words with meaning that isn't present on the page." Not only is Mrs. Flowers inspiring Maya to speak here, she's emphasizing the importance of the spoken word or the oral tradition. This idea is further supported by the text. Quote, "She," meaning Mrs. Flowers, "said that I must always be intolerant of ignorance, but understanding of illiteracy. That some people, unable to go to school, were more educated and even more intelligent than college professors. She encouraged me to listen carefully to what country people called mother wit. That in those homely sayings was couched the collective wisdom of generations," end quote. Miss Flowers highlights for Maya that just because someone is book smart doesn't mean that they are intelligent, and intelligent people aren't necessarily book smart. For example, personally, one of the reasons that I got, into studying literature is because my grandfather was a great storyteller, and I wanted to learn how to tell stories like Grandpa. But my grandfather only had a third grade education. In spite of that, he still managed to be an excellent craftsman of words and an excellent, unpacker of narrative structures, and the guy was a great storyteller. What is called the spoken or oral tradition is a big deal for both all of humanity in general and African Americans especially. If we recall history, we'll remember that human beings existed on this planet and communicated with one another long before cave paintings, hieroglyphics, and books ever came into existence. Furthermore, speaking to African Americans specifically, we'll remember that when Africans were both sold by Africans to Europeans and more frequently stolen from Africa by Europeans, when they arrived in America, they did not speak English. They spoke a variety of languages, and they learned to speak English before they learned to write it. So a great deal of the African American literary tradition was passed down from generation to generation in the form of spoken stories. Miss Flowers further intensifies her point to Maya about the value of the spoken word when she reads to her from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Upon hearing Miss Flowers read, Maya says, quote, "I heard poetry for the first time in my life. Her voice slid in and curved down through and over the words. She was nearly singing. I wanted to look at the pages. Were they the same as I had read? Or were there notes, music lined on the pages, as in a hymn book? Her sounds began cascading gently," end quote. Maya is so shocked when she hears Miss Flowers read that she suspects Miss Flowers' book might be different from her own. She even states that she suspects that Miss Flowers' book might contain musical notes, telling her how to change the inflection of her voice or how to sing each word. As it's often said, poetry is meant to be heard, not read. How a poet decides to read a word or where a poet decides to pause while reading can have a huge impact on the tone or meaning of the text. Take sarcasm, for example, with the line, "I would love to come to your birthday party. I'm the kind of guy who really loves birthday parties." If I read this regular, it would sound authentic, but if I emphasized the words love, your, and really, it would make the sentence sound sarcastic and convey the opposite meaning, like, "I would love to come to your birthday party. I'm the kind of guy who really loves birthday parties." A similar thing can be said about where a poet decides to pause while reading or where they decide to place a comma. Obviously, "let's eat, Grandpa," has a completely different meaning than "let's eat, Grandpa." Poets also rely heavily on homophones or words that when spoken sound like other words. And in the Beyonce song Formation, for example, the refrain, quote, "Okay ladies, now let's get information," can also be heard as, "Okay ladies, now let's get information." This allows Beyonce's listeners to make critical connections between the role information plays in feminist politics or feminist formations. Poets and songwriters are masters at mumbling pronunciation so that multiple things can be heard at once. We know that "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," Miss Flowers celebrates the multiple meaning of words because when she gives Maya books to read, Maya says, quote, "She suggested that I try to make a sentence sound as many different ways as possible," end quote. This celebration of multiple meanings in language is sharply contrasted by Grandma Henderson in the text, because when in the end of the chapter, she whips Maya for using the phrase, quote, "by the way," which Grandma Henderson takes as cursing or blasphemy. Maya says, quote, "I found that my violation lay in using the phrase 'by the way.' Mama explained that Jesus was the way, and anyone who says 'by the way' is really saying 'by Jesus.'" Opposite Miss Flowers, there is a right way and a wrong way to interpret language for Mama. So for today's assignment, I want you guys to silently read the poem Cut by Sylvia Plath. Then I want you to listen to Sylvia Plath read the poem Cut. Finally, I want you to answer a series of questions that encourage you to compare and contrast what happens when you read the text cold versus when you listen to Sylvia Plath read the text.